Mask of a Diva, a Stan Kraychik mystery, Book 4, 1994. Author, Grant Michaels. Publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York. Author, Eric Aust. For all the divas, operatic and otherwise. Chapter 23. I rang Daniel's room and announced myself to him over the intercom. "No visitors today," he said. "I'm not well." "I'll only stay a few minutes," I said. "It's very important." "What's it about?" "The wigs," I replied, and he buzzed me in. Even though I knew the room number, it was easier to find his place along the hallway. I was directed by the unmistakable voice of Maria Calais, penetrating through the door. As soon as I saw him, I knew he'd been crying. His eyes were swollen and red. He was dressed completely in black. He'd even dyed his hair black for the occasion of Marcella Ostanana's death. The curtains over the windows were drawn to keep his room dark and still. Still except for Maria Calais' recorded attempt to sustain a high B flat against a full orchestra. He stood in the half-open door and asked, "What happened?" "I'd like to talk to you." "You said the wig room." "I lied. I had to see you." He raised his eyebrows slightly. "So impetuous," he said with a wan smile. "It's been years since anyone had to see me." I said, "Can I come in?" "It's about Marcella, isn't it?" "Yes, I'm assisting the police to find the killer." "So," he said with an arched brow, "does that mean you get to work with that hot cop?" "I'm helping the Boston police," I said flatly. Daniel sneered. "Then by all means, come in and ask your questions." I went in, but there was nowhere to sit. The bed and the two chairs were strewn with clothes. Even the floor was covered with piles of them. The stuff was all first-rate too, designer labels in current fashion. For the extent of his pricey wardrobe, Daniel Carafalio dressed pretty crummy. "The only question I have," I said, "is kind of personal, but it has a direct bearing on the case." "I know what you're going to ask. Where was I when Marcella was murdered? Isn't that it?" "That's exactly what the police wanted to know." "Not quite. I want to know whom you were with." "What?" "The security report shows that you left the performance center at midnight the night before last and didn't return until 7 o'clock the following morning." Daniel said, "So, is this a boarding school? Do I need permission slip to roam off campus?" "If Madama Ostanada hadn't been killed, nobody would care what you did." "But you do." "I'm doing this for the police, not myself." "Well, I'll tell you exactly what I told the police then," said Daniel. "I had a trick that night." "A trick?" "Yes. Remember those? Or do you find tricks too déglacé in your high and mighty married state?" I was about to say not at all, but Daniel's question caused a tinge of regret. See, in my so-called monogamous partnership, I had been the one to break the pledge, not my lover. Based on the flimsiest evidence, I had assumed that he'd fallen first. That done, I saw no reason for me to hold to the original agreement. The irony was, seeing us as a couple, with him so sexy and me so ordinary, no one would guess that I was the libertine. I said to Daniel, "What was his name?" "I never kiss and tell." "Your alibi will have to be corroborated." "Such big words you use now that you're working for that." Daniel sucked air in through his clenched teeth. "That big Italian stud." "Is he big? Do you get to see him in the locker room?" "Yes." "No." "Oh, I can tell by the look on your face you don't." "Too bad. I bet it's a juicy one." "Daniel, you might as well tell me the guy's name. You're going to have to tell the police anyway." "Then I'll wait for the beefcake to ask me." "Suit yourself. You'll have a good time at your expense." Daniel frowned and considered what I'd said. I think I know the type. Huge closet door, right? Solid bronze with barricades and trenches and lots of ammunition aimed directly at us. Are you consorting with the enemy? Was I? Branco had used that word too. Ammunition. Perhaps the ammunition he was keeping from his fellow officers was being turned against every other gay man. But that wasn't true either. Branco was beginning to show signs of tolerance for us. Acceptance, even. For me, at least. One at a time was better than none. By the way, said Daniel, just to save that red-headed little brow of yours some worry, the trick's name was Butch. Butch. That's right, Butch. Do you have trouble with English? Butch what? I said. Just Butch. Might as well have been Dick. I had Dick the night before, said Daniel. I'll bet you did. What about Rick? Have you had him too? Daniel's beady eyes shot a nasty glance at me. Rick Jansen? That tired thing? From my position, the pot was calling the kettle black. I said, you know Rick, then? Been there, done that, he said affectedly. I take that to be a yes. Yes, yes, yes. Who are you, Dr. Ruth? You need footnotes? Yes, Rick Jansen gave me a long, hard ride in Spoleto last summer. Yes, he's got a tight, smooth body, and yes, among the family jewels lies an extra wide choker. Then maybe you wanted a little reunion with him out here in Abigail. A stroll to the candy store for old time's sake? You don't know anything, roared Daniel. Then he laughed derisively and said, Rick Jansen is wearing blinders these days. He's in love, if that's what you can call it, with Jonathan Byers. Sir Jonathan Byers. It began last year in Spoleto, when Ricky started flirting with the recently dubbed Sir John. A year-long chase ensued, and John finally gave in. But the price for night fucking is damn high. John has made Rick swear off casual sex, which is certainly unfair given the Sir's own blatant lechery, that pig. And certainly tragic for the rest of us, giving Rick's natural talents with his thing. The prince. I guess I didn't realize how lucky I was, I said. I just turned down an offer to get acquainted with his princely thing. Daniel spat the word. When? Backstage, maybe half an hour ago. You're lying. No, Rick told me exactly what he wanted to do to me. You're trying to provoke me, aren't you? He was seething. Who instigated it? You. He did. I never made the first move. Daniel eyed me slyly. Did he pull it out and show you? No, maybe Daniel was just trying to verify my claim and have me recite the specs of Rick's thing. But I took the vulgar question as my cue to get back to work. I said, when was the last time you saw Madame Ostinata? It caught him off guard, and he spun at me with an angry glare. What kind of question is that? A very simple one. It's not even incriminating unless the last time you saw her was when you sliced her throat. I told you where I was that night. But when did you see her? The last time I saw Marcella was in rehearsal. Then he added smugly, I believe you were there too. But Daniel Carafelio's alibi was non-existent, unless some guy named Butch stepped forward and confirmed that he had spent the night with him. And what self-respecting fag would admit to such a thing except under grave duress? And now, said Daniel, having an exasperated sigh, if you don't mind, I'm really tired of you. I replied, I could use some air myself. I left him and headed back to the opera house. So much for my 2 hot leads from the security report. All I'd got from them was more tangles that led nowhere. I already knew why Rick Jansen and Sir Jonathan Byers weren't on the report. They were sharing dig at Abigail's oldest luxury hotel, the Abigail Arms. Then I wondered, since the hamlet of Abigail by the Sea didn't offer any hopping night spots for people with active sex lives, Did Daniel Carafalio perhaps spend the night with one, or even both, of the other two men? He claimed to know Rick already. Perhaps he also knew Jonathan Byers. I'd heard Spoleto was a lively place. Perhaps the threesome had been frolicking in reunion the very night Marcella Ostanana's vocal cords were being severed. Anything was possible in the suburbs, even among people who didn't particularly care for one another. Back at the Opera House, the musicians were still rehearsing. Apparently, Jonathan Byers had placated the maestro into staying on with the production because the old man was seated next to Carolyn Boetz at the piano. As though nothing had happened that morning, I sat in the back of the auditorium and watched a while. With all the seats empty, the stage was like a huge shadow box, but with living creatures inside. Where they were on stage, April Kilkis, a Wong Young Cho, the nameless tenor, assorted other soloists, a rousing chorus, and the maestro and Carolyn Boetz at the piano, all in the work of making beautiful sounds about the horrors of betrayal and murder. Yet one of those very people had likely committed the dreadful deed in real life, perhaps more than once. Still, I found myself enjoying it all. The rehearsal broke earlier than usual because the first lighting run-through was scheduled that evening. The first session is always done without singers to save wear and tear on the supposedly delicate creatures. Daphne was waiting outside the Opera House to drive the maestro and me back to the mansion. During the drive, the maestro excitedly told Daphne about the sacrilege that was being committed against Verdi in the production. At one point, he raised his voice vehemently, just as he had done that morning. "This Byers, he makes a sin against opera. He will burn in hell for what he does to Verdi." Apparently, the truce between the maestro and Jonathan Byers had been conditional, and it was quite a different stance from before, when the maestro had tried to quell Madame Ostanana's outrage over the preposterous interpretation of Verdi's work. Now the maestro was condemning Sir John to hell, just as Madama had done. But Daphne answered him brightly. "Times are different, maestro." She faced him as she continued talking. Perhaps Verdi himself would have set things differently if he were alive now. There's nothing to do but bend with the wind. Otherwise, Grand Opera will become as brittle as an old museum piece, and then it will shatter and vanish. You don't want to do that, do you? Shatter and vanish is what almost happened to us in the Bentley, since Daphne had let the car wander precariously close to the edge of the ocean road. From the back seat, I made a strangled kind of croaking sound to alert her, but she smoothly maneuvered the car back on course. She glanced in the rearview mirror and said, "Thank you, dear, but I do know the road." The maestro, absolutely unperturbed, smiled wanly. "Verdi should live forever," he said, "but he must have respect. These musicians are like children. They want to play with him, but they do not know what they are doing." Daphne said, "Be thankful that Verdi appeals to them at all. They're bright, and they'll keep him alive and fresh." I knew that her words reflected the hope that a progressive approach to opera might assure the festival's success this year and forever after. Somehow her words, or more likely the delivery of them, placated the old man, and he nodded and smiled. Then Daphne said to me, "How are the wigs? I hope that things have settled down into a nice routine with your boss." "Yes," I said tentatively. "Just fine." "That's nice," said Daphne. "I'm afraid at home the developments have been a little less pleasant. I decided to admit Bruce David to McLean Hospital this afternoon. He'll receive the best possible care." The maestro brightened suddenly and said, "The second Riccardo is very good, very dramatic. He will sing well." Daphne said, "Yes, but at what cost to dear young Bruce?" I imagined that Bruce's cover, a serviceable if uninspiring tenor, would probably blossom under the maestro's renewed verve and attention to the music. It also helped that the tenor would have April Kilkis as his new and certain partner. It almost seemed too good to be true, or too good to be coincidental. But the nameless tenor was hardly a suspect in killing Madama Ostinata. He'd simply gained by her death. Just the way April Kilkis had the good fortune to get that recording contract and the televised broadcast. It was a law of physics made into a law of survival, that every event, no matter how good or bad, had some opposite event connected to it to balance its effects. Guru babble meant I was tired and hungry. When we arrived at the house, I was both elated and uneasy to see Lieutenant Branco's Alpha in the driveway. Daphne exclaimed, "Oh dear, now what?" As it turned out, Mathilda had vanished from the premises. Parker explained to Daphne that he had called the Boston police to report the disappearance. He said, "I wasn't sure what to do in your absence, Miss Davenport. It was hardly an emergency, but it did seem to call for action. I hope I did the correct thing." "Well done, Parker," Daphne assured him. "Of course, you had to call the police." Then she turned toward Branco and offered her hand. "And now the lieutenant has returned here sooner than we might have expected." Branco said, "I'd be talking with my deputy anyway." He nodded toward me, and my bosom swelled with pride, just like Della's streets after a crumb of attention from Perry Mason. The maestro excused himself for a rest before dinner, and Parker escorted him up to his room. Daphne took Branco and me into the library, where she offered us drinks. Branco resisted, and Daphne insisted. Finally, he yielded. "Seltzer," he said. "I'm driving." "Surely, one little drop can't hurt," said Daphne. "I don't let my crew drink on duty," said Branco. "The same goes for me. When this case is settled, then I'll celebrate." What exactly did that mean for Branco, to celebrate? He and I sat in the two winged-back armchairs facing the fireplace while Daphne made our drinks at the liquor cart. Once she served us, I gave her my seat and sat on the arm of the chair. Then Branco asked Daphne if she'd known of Mathilda's plans to leave Abigail. "Not at all," said Daphne. "It's so sudden. I hope she isn't in any danger." "Not yet," said Branco. "She took her bags with her, so she clearly planned this escape." "Escape?" blurted Daphne. "That's how I see it," said Branco. Daphne said, "Do you have any idea where she went?" "I've got an APB out on her now." I knew that meant an all-points bulletin, which was a search of near global bounds. "We'll find her," said Branco. "She didn't get much of a start. I sure hope she has a good reason for this, because I'm just about ready to nail her." I said, "For the murder?" Branco nodded. "On what evidence?" "Basically on her statement. You may recall her admission that she had purposely over-sedated the victim." I nodded. "At Madama's request." Branco went on. "I think she planned that story too. She seemed too glib about it. After administering that same potion countless times to the same high-strung woman, that maid should have known exactly what increasing dosage was needed. But she acted as though it was the first time for both of them. After reconsidering her testimony, I think she was lying. Besides, she had a good motive." At that moment, I noticed that Parker had appeared in the library. "Is everyone served?" he asked. Daphne said, "Yes, thank you, Parker." He lingered at the liquor cart, checking the ice and seltzer. "What was Mathilda's motive?" I said to Branco. He replied, "Marcella Ostinata was about to relieve her servant of her duties." "After 25 years of faithful service," I said. "Yep," went the cop. "To be replaced by her personal accompanist, Rick Jansen." Silence all around. I said, "What did he have to say about that?" "Jansen claims the singer hadn't told him anything about it. I talked with Byers right away, too, before the two of them could collaborate on a story." "Unless they already had," I said. "No," said Branco, "I don't think Byers knew anything either. He got pretty agitated when I told him. I guess he expects Jansen to hang on to him forever." That wasn't the story I'd heard from Rick earlier. when he claimed that Sir John was ready to throw him out of his bed. What about Mathilda, I said. Was Madama Ostinata going to provide for her in any way? Not a cent, said Branco. After all those years, I said. Discomforted glances passed between Daphne and Parker. Parker said, I'll see to dinner, Miss Davenport. Daphne said, Thank you, but she sounded unsettled. When Parker had left us, Daphne asked the question, How did you learn all that about Marcella releasing Mathilda from service? I spoke to the attorneys in Milan, replied the cop. I called them today about the woman's will. I thought there might be something useful there. Branco sipped his seltzer. I said, Was there? Was there what? He said. Cat and mouse. Was there anything incriminating in the will? I mean, did anyone here at the festival stand to gain or lose anything by Marcella's death? Branco smirked. You'll have to tone down your techniques, Dan. That's two separate questions. Then he said, I'll answer the second one first. Somebody obviously expected to gain something or else prevent its loss, which is why the woman was murdered. And the will, I said. In terms of the will, nothing. No individual is named in her will. So, where's all her money going, I asked. That's the strangest thing, said Branco. She bequeathed her entire estate to two institutions. Half goes to an opera house in Barry, the one where Marcella Ostinata made her debut and had her first success. And the other half, I said. To an orphanage in the same town, said Branco. Well, said Daphne, at least no one can be accused of killing Marcella for her money. Branco drained his glass and said, I still haven't ruled it out completely. And Daphne asked him to stay for dinner with an apology. I'm afraid it's going to be vegetarian, she said. I don't think I can quite stomach the sight of meat yet. But as I expected, Branco declined the invitation. Before he left, he wanted to talk to me privately. Daphne let us use the library since she wanted to freshen up before dinner. Branco thanked her for the drink and said good night to her. She said, But it was only water. It's the thought, he replied. Then I related my day's work to him, the argument at the opera house between Jonathan Byers and the maestro, the security report on April Kilkis, Hwang Young Cho, and Daniel Carafalio, Maurizio's high-flying act on the backstage catwalks, and even Rick Jansen's crass offer of sex. Branco laughed and said, You get them coming and going. I don't want any of it, Lieutenant. I just want a home and hearth, he said. Obviously, you're not ready for that, but then he complimented me on my work, that I was on the right track, chasing down people's whereabouts that night. It's all a matter of timing, he said, and he told me the results of the autopsy report that Marcella Ostinata had died around 4 o'clock in the morning, based on the temperature of the body when the police got to her, and on the state of the stomach contents, on the time she had supposedly last eaten. Unfortunately, said the cop, this last bit comes from the maid's testimony, which, as you know, I don't believe at all. I told Branco what I'd learned from Mathilda the night before, how she'd always wanted to be a singer, and how Madama Ostinata had promised from the beginning to help nurture her talent, but over the years managed to thwart every possibility of Mathilda's ever singing. Branco said, Good work, Stan. Now we've got one more motivation for the maid, revenge. What's my next assignment, I said. Just keep nosing around. You're doing fine. Branco departed, and minutes later, Daphne and the maestro came into the library for a last cocktail before dinner. Parker took our drink orders and congratulated the maestro on the news of the big recording contract. He squinted one eye at me like a weary rodent. Daphne exclaimed, Isn't it wonderful? Finally, the maestro will have a recording. The opera world has been waiting so long for this. I kept my eye on the maestro and said, I wonder why I was the last to know. But my dear, Daphne exclaimed, why would you? It has nothing to do with you. Daphne, I've spoken with everyone at the festival, both before and after Madama's death, and no one ever said a word about recording contract. Now suddenly it's headline news. Oh, I think you're taking it too seriously. With all the horrid events of the last few days, it completely slipped my mind, too. Then the maestro turned himself toward me and addressed me with the candor of a Dutch uncle. Young men, it is better not to talk about such a thing until it is certain. But now, he said with a beneficent smile, now we have signed the papers and it is certain, so we can talk. Yes, I am happy. He smiled a wide, bright smile that showed off his excellent teeth. His eyes radiated the joy of attaining a long-sought success after a lifetime of struggle. Or was it a lifetime of deception? Daphne quickly asked Parker to open some champagne to celebrate the signing of the contract. But the whole thing, the excuses, the pronouncements, the champagne, all seemed an afterthought. If I hadn't said anything to the maestro, would we be celebrating at all? Still, Parker popped the cork and we all enjoyed the vintage bubbly. And for a brief while, no one thought about the late Marcella Ostinata. I asked Daphne about Maurizio's membership in the Stagehands Union, and she explained blithely. He has an interest and a talent for that kind of work, so I helped the wheels turn a little faster and more smoothly in his favor. What else is money for but to help people? Maybe your intervention spoiled a chance for him to prove that he can do things for himself. Push, said Daphne. Maurizio has enough challenge in his daily life without a catalogue of union rules on top of it. Matter closed. After that, the evening progressed pleasantly, a marked change from the perpetual conflicts of the earlier hours. The maestro even enjoyed the vegetarian dinner, for how could he not? Parker had filled our plates with steaming fresh produce, native grown, no less, in artistic arrangements that would have challenged the culinary deities of California. However, matters changed when I headed back to the cottage that night. I felt uneasy the moment I left the big house, and the feeling worsened the further I got from it. It was the same inexplicable fear that had gripped me the first night I had been in the estate. I felt pursued. I told myself it was irrational, that I was completely safe, that no one had hurt me that time, and no one would hurt me now. In fact, that first night, I had been visited by the sexy Maurizio. Perhaps he was about to pay another call. Dynamic monogamy. I had just turned down the last leg of the pathway to the cottage when I realized that one of the lamps on the path had gone out. It was extremely dark there, and I quickened my step. But I sensed it was in vain. I felt it coming just as it happened, a rustle from the dense, prickly vegetation, and then an arm was wrapped around my neck, pulling me off balance. Before my eyes in the moonlight flashed the glint of steel, the blade of a big knife aimed at my throat. "Murray!" said the voice in a hoarse whisper. He pulled the knife back, ready to strike. "Murray!" My thoughts raced. Not to my mother, or to my lover, or my friends, or even my cat, but instead fled to Tosca and Scarpia. In those fatal final seconds of their rendezvous, and then at the exact moment when the blade should have begun its arced traversal of my throat, and the warm blood would flow freely and my life would ebb away, that's when I grabbed behind myself for balance, I guess for something, a last hold on some earthly object from my pitiful farewell to the mortal coil, and what I felt in my grasp was as stark and as familiar as my own DNA, identifiable even in those last moments of cognizance. I heard my final breath come out as an ironic little laugh at the ultimate joke the life had played on me, for I had grabbed hold of my assailant's erect cock, which was sticking out the front of his trousers. "Jesus," I muttered. And then my savior did appear, though not garbed in flowing white robes. In fact, I saw nothing save the knife from my attacker's hand fly upwards into the air, and then land safely away from us with a loud clink on the paved path. I swooned and fell to the ground. I sensed a brief tussle between savior and assailant, but I recognized neither one. The sole identifying clue came just before they both ran off, when my attacker grabbed his knife and my rescuer bolted after him. It was the familiar nasal sound made by only one person among all the people I'd met in Abigail. I had been saved by Maurizio. I lay on the path for a few minutes to catch my breath. Then I jumped up in a final stage of adrenaline and ran to the cottage. Once inside, I closed and locked all the windows and doors as though that would ensure my safety. I telephoned Daphne at the big house and told her what had happened. She said she would call the police, and I agreed, for whatever good it did. I had expected Lieutenant Branco to show up and save the day, but instead the Abigail police came and took the report. They made a half-hearted search around the path where I'd been jumped, but of course they found no knife. My attacker had taken it, and since the path was paved, there was no evidence of a struggle either. I showed them the bruise on my forearm where I'd fallen on it, but I knew they didn't believe me. Fine, I thought. When Maurizio turns up, he'll explain everything, but he didn't turn up. Not that night, anyway. Daphne insisted that I stay with her in the big house. I told her it hardly mattered to me, since it was no safer there than in the cottage, not after the recent crisis. Then I realized that she wanted me to be in the big house to comfort her as much as for my own safety, so I packed my overnight kit and went to stay with her. The one small hitch was that the only guest quarters ready on such short notice was the ones Bruce David had just vacated. What an act to follow. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.